Modern
Hi,
warfare
Alex.
does seem to be rapidly evolving. Tell us more about that. How concerned should we be?
Well, we're hearing a lot of things that are sound good in Hollywood, but the reality and the practicalities are very different. I would argue the arms race in the 20th century was much more dangerous than that in the 21st century. But we are still hearing these sensational accounts of the hypersonic missile, the potential for biological weapons, sound weapons. The practicalities behind a lot of these don't match the hype that they're getting as well. However, the worrying things are the destruction of the satellite in space. But even more worrying should be the development of some of our conventional military capabilities that are out there, because there are certain nations, especially in the South China Seas area, developing what are called power projection capabilities, and they're changing political wherewithal to use those. And that's probably more dangerous than these highly sophisticated weapons. There's always been an arms race. There's always been a technological race.
Yeah, it's a continuation of a familiar narrative, especially to those brought up during the Cold War period. But we have different players joining the game now, don't we? Players such as China. And I think the Pentagon are especially concerned about how fast the Chinese are able to evolve their arsenal and create weapons that could possibly evade intervention.
They are. China's been on a rapid program over the last few years of professionalizing their military, re-equipping their military with sophisticated capabilities, developing what is called power projection capability. So we've got submarines, we've got aircraft carriers, we've got marine capability, the ability to take Chinese influence, take it somewhere else in the world, and project that power from a military perspective. That's the worrying bit. And then highly sophisticated and technical weapons, the rush into space and everything else. Now, from a US perspective, from an allied perspective, are we going to admit that we can see them whenever they're doing things and can track them as they're doing it? It's much better that we get out in the public domain that we can't see them. We don't know what's going on. The Chinese are very good at acquiring other people's intellectual property. So a lot of the research behind this new technology, they have taken from other universities and other military technological establishments around the globe. That's what they're particularly good at.
I mean, what's the risk here of power projection bleeding into an actual disaster? Because the Chinese have struck up some fairly unsavoury friendships over the years with countries such as North Korea, who don't exactly seem to be a picture of modernity and stability. And they've got involvement with Afghanistan and the Taliban. There are allegations that they are building a close relationship with other countries in the Middle East. These are all very well-recognised foes of the West. If these countries all end up with sophisticated capabilities, can we trust that one of them isn't going to press the button?
Well, the pressing the button is the final bit. China's developing things from an economic perspective. They own large chunks of Africa. All of our electronic devices that we've got, your phones, your cameras, your cars, your sophisticated weapons, all rely on rare earth metals. The Chinese control 90% of the supply of those around the globe. They can influence what can be made and what can't be, and they've got a much greater economic influence globally than they have military influence. But they are growing that because they're growing their global interest across the board. But it's not just them, it's also the relationship they have with the likes of Russia. And if we look at Vladimir Putin, he has exercised his power projection capability by annexing Crimea and supporting the rebels in the eastern part of Ukraine. And the threat that he's putting in both into Ukraine with the exercise going on at the moment, and supporting what's going on in Belarus and pushing people as a weapon across, trying to push them into Poland to destabilize Europe, is frightening. And it's bringing all of these things together that makes the globe a much more unstable place.
Yeah, I mean, we have heard the Chinese are repeatedly doing exercises around Taiwan. Russia, as you said, are amassing troops on the border with the Ukraine again. And we have said in Britain, if China goes into Taiwan, we would act, as has America. We haven't been as vociferous, I don't believe, when it comes to the situation concerning Ukraine. But if these countries did decide to conduct some form of invasion or annexation, and we did step in and want to put boots on the ground, what could result of that?
Well, I think politically we'd see a very stiff letter written by the Prime Minister and the President, and possibly elements of the United Nations. Of course, China and Russia are permanent members of the Security Council, so there'd never be a Security Council resolution that would undermine what they're doing. Militarily, we can show that we have a capability. And it's no accident that HMS Queen Elizabeth carried out her first deployment down into the South China Seas and sailed through there, showing China what was going on. That was for two reasons. One, to demonstrate to China that there's resolve in the region. The second was to actually see what China's response would be so that we could gather intelligence against the Chinese as to what their reactions are. The one advantage we have over the Chinese is that they don't have any recent combat experience. They don't have that ability in understanding how to bring all of the elements together, whereas British forces, US forces, and all the rest of it have been virtually in combat situations for since the start of the Second World War. I think there's been 1 year since then that we haven't actually been involved in a conflict.
Well, I hope you're right, and that plays in our favour if anything does go a bit west. Philip Ingram, MBE, always delighted to have you on the show. Thank you so much for your insights. Well, let's now go live to Washington, D.C. I'm joined by Elizabeth Bohr, a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Elizabeth, much of your work focuses on modern deterrence against emerging forms of aggression. Is advanced weaponry, like physical weapons like missiles and guns, or does it go deeper than that?
Well, they are certainly a new threat to our countries, but a new threat in the sense that it's better technology, better weaponry than we have seen before. But I think an even more significant development in the past few years, and especially in the past few months, is the use of non-military weapons as a tool to weaken our societies. And we're seeing it at the moment at the Polish border with Belarus very vividly and very dramatically. And that's what I think we need to be concerned about most of all, because with new weapons, we have similar capabilities ourselves, even though you could say, well, maybe they're not as good, but we have some sort of capabilities. With these new threats, we have basically no way of defending ourselves, because it's so different from the way we have usually thought about conflict and wars.
Hypersonic missiles and blowing up satellites. What of things such as bio-warfare, chemical warfare, cyber warfare?
Well, it all blends together, right? And that's the point, or the reason why countries such as Russia and China and now even Belarus use these, what you might call innovative forms of aggression, because you can use a whole range, and the only limit you have is the limit of your imagination, which is why somebody like Alexander Lukashenko, leader of Belarus, self-declared president of Belarus, could, even though he doesn't have very strong armed forces, even though he doesn't have a lot of money, his country doesn't have a lot of money, he could then turn to a completely new form of aggression, i.e. migrants, or weaponizing migrants. But when it comes to what else we could expect, I think we should be concerned about weaponization of viruses, for example. So what if, now in this case, as we have seen with COVID, it was Mother Nature. I think we can all conclude it was Mother Nature who came up with the virus, and then it spread very quickly. But what if a country decided to use a virus and as a resulting epidemic as a threat against other countries? So that's something we need to be concerned about. And I know Bill Gates, for example, has warned about that recently as well. So a very new form of aggression, and one that, again, we are not really set up to deal with, because it involves more than governments. It involves citizens knowing what to do.
It seems to me that we're again in an era of mass proliferation of weaponry. When I'd done my research and looked at how much the US are spending on modernising warfare, and we look at recent newspaper reports of experiments being carried out by Russia, by China, the braggadocio of North Korea, onwards and onwards. It seems to me that everything's escalating and beginning to rapidly pick up pace, but there don't seem to be the same sort of checks and balances or big public conversations about this. Is that something that concerns you?
Well, I think the big concern that I have is that we have been spoiled during 30 years of peace here in the West, and indeed in large parts of the world. So we in the West, meaning NATO countries, EU member states, North America, we are so used to not having to worry about national security. We are so used to outsourcing every national security concern to people wearing uniform. But now, as we have seen, the threats that we have to worry about, that we have to tackle, are not just the sort of threats that the armed forces can sort out. It's threats that we as citizens and that we as the wider civil society have to play a role in tackling, or otherwise we have no chance. And for example, with the Colonial Pipeline incident in the US in May, now it was a criminal gang that perpetrated it, but it could have equally been a state-sponsored gang, and it brought down the whole East Coast, not just the incident itself, but the fact that people panicked. So if we think about that, it's these things will happen again. What is the role of society in trying to at least soften the blow of such aggression? And that's where I think there is enormous work that can be done, and that should be done. And the good news is that everybody, I think, would agree that doing their part is in their interest, and as a result, our societies will be better set up. Nobody will say, well, I'd better make the situation worse. No, because we all want complete convenience in our societies, and that's what we can build on.
Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining me. Elizabeth Boyle, security expert and columnist. Now, lecturer in war studies at King's College London, Dr. Zeno Leone, also joins me. When we look at potential peril here in the UK, who and what are our biggest threats?
Well, when you look at threats, there are so many out there, and that's the challenge, because you need to try to prioritize in order to develop a coherent strategy for the future, and to set up the right kind of procurement, military procurement that you need. I think looking at the integrated review of Boris Johnson's government, published in March 2021, the priority is great powers relations, and so in particular UK-China relations. I think it was very prominent, the fact that China was described as the greatest economic threat to British economic security. And this wasn't only in the UK. If we look at the most recent national security strategies in the US, in India, and in other countries, clearly great power competition is back in fashion, is really the priorities at the top of the list of these countries. And that's why this government has also been pushing for an increase of nuclear warheads.
It seems to me that when you say it's all about, the big powers sort of, flaunting their wares on the world stage, this concept of power projection is leading to a sort of a speeding up of proliferation of extremely dangerous arms. Is that something that countries in Europe, countries like the UK, need to be involved in to make sure that there is this threat of mutually assured destruction? Or should, as a world, we be sitting down, as the UN often recommends, and having a sensible dialogue about reducing the amount of disastrous armaments that we're stockpiling?
Yeah, first of all, I'd like to say that I think what is currently happening with what you call a new arm race is it's certainly a new stage in the arm race, but it's very much about some of the great powers, especially China and Russia, trying to make some breakthroughs, to leapfrog, to skip stages of development in order to catch up in areas where they're still behind, especially China. Militarily speaking, is behind in several areas, and so it tries to catch up with investing in artificial intelligence or hypersonic missiles. But actually, this sort of race, in my view, hides a lot of weaknesses when it comes to these rising great powers. Anyway, to answer your question, I think if you're not able, and when I say you, I mean the UK, if somebody is unable to keep at the top of that game of the arm race, which is undesirable anyway, but if you're unable to keep up at the top of the game, I think it's definitely better to invest in a diplomacy for peace. For example, to train your diplomats, to get to know your opponents, the strategic culture of your opponents. Only very recently, we knew very little about China, as several governmental sources have acknowledged. So promoting those summits, those spaces where there can be some transparency, where we can kind of understand what exactly these great powers want and maybe come down to an agreement, is very difficult to do at this stage, because we're going through a transition towards a new world order, which means that the old balance of power is being disrupted, and there is not a world leader that is capable of leading this process, this diplomacy for peace. So that's why it's very challenging.
Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows, and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.